Welcome back to Strange Epochs. I'm Sean Spainhour, and this is the show where we take one strange, true, documented moment from somewhere in the long and bewildering span of human history, and we sit with it. New episodes every Tuesday. Sources are always in the episode description. This week's episode is, by any measure, the strangest thing we have covered so far. And we have covered dancing plagues and papal corpses and pig trials and a man who thinks 300 years of history were faked. So that is saying something. On March 3rd, 1876, on a clear afternoon in Bath County, Kentucky, it rained meat. Not rain with meat in it, not a storm that knocked over a butcher's cart. Chunks of raw flesh falling from a cloudless sky onto a farm near the community of Olympian Springs, in quantities sufficient to cover an area roughly the size of a football field, in pieces ranging from the size of a hailstone to the size of a woman's hand, for approximately 2 minutes, with no explanation before or after. The event was reported in the New York Times. It was written up in Scientific American. Samples of the meat were collected, preserved, and sent to laboratories across the country for analysis. The analysis confirmed that the material was genuine animal tissue, lung, cartilage, muscle, connective tissue, all the component parts of something that had recently been alive. It was real meat. It had fallen from the sky. The best explanation anyone has ever produced for how this happened involves vultures. Mass vomiting vultures. The second best explanation involves something called no-stock. The third best explanation, offered by a humorist for the New York Times, was that the meat came from an exploding planet. None of these explanations is fully satisfying. The meat fell, the sky was clear, and 150 years later, Bath County, Kentucky, still holds an annual festival to commemorate the day it rained flesh. Let's begin. This episode will leave you with the most probable explanation for what happened. It will not leave you with certainty. The Kentucky meat shower is one of those events that has been documented, analyzed, and discussed for 150 years and still sits in that specific uncomfortable position of being explainable without being fully explained. We know what probably happened. We cannot prove it. And that gap between almost certainly and definitely is exactly the gap that Strange Epochs lives in. Bath County, Kentucky, March 3rd, 1876, a Friday afternoon. Rebecca Crouch is standing outside her farmhouse, making soap. This is ordinary. This is a March Friday on a Kentucky farm in 1876, which means it is a day of work, of the specific physical labor of rural life in the post-Civil War American South. Making soap is not a simple task. It requires lye and rendered fat and careful attention to temperature, and you do it outside because the fumes are unpleasant and the risk of fire is real. Rebecca is an experienced farm wife. She has made soap before. She knows what a normal afternoon looks like. Bath County in 1876 is a rural farming community in the foothills of eastern Kentucky, part of the Appalachian Fringe, a landscape of rolling hills and small farms, and the kind of deeply rooted local life that had been built over generations and then disrupted, like everything else in Kentucky, by the Civil War. The war had ended 11 years earlier. The wounds were still present. The community was rebuilding in the way that communities rebuild after catastrophic violence, by getting on with the work, by maintaining the ordinary rhythms of farm life, by treating each normal day as its own small victory against everything that had tried to unmake the world. A Friday afternoon of soap making in early March is exactly that kind of small victory. It is the ordinary holding. The sky is perfectly clear. There is no wind to speak of. The sun is out. It is a fine March day, by any reasonable measure, cold enough to be brisk, clear enough to be pleasant. the kind of late winter afternoon that feels like a small gift after the gray months. And then something hits the ground nearby. She looks. It is a piece of meat, a chunk of raw flesh, roughly 2 inches square, lying in the dirt a few feet away. Before she can fully process what she is seeing, another piece falls, and another. It is raining meat. Not spattering, not drizzling, falling in distinct chunks, each piece landing with a sound she would later describe to a reporter as a snapping-like noise when they hit the dirt. Pieces of raw flesh dropping from a cloudless Kentucky sky onto the Crouch family farm, sticking to the fence posts, scattering across the grass, landing on the roof of the outbuildings, falling all around her. Her husband, Alan, watching from nearby, would say afterward that it fell like large snowflakes. It lasted approximately 2 minutes. When it stopped, the ground was covered. The chunks were spread across an area roughly 100 yards long and 50 yards wide. Most were small, 2 or 3 inches across. Some were considerably larger, up to 4 inches. The material was clearly flesh of some kind. It was fresh. A local grocer named Joe Jordan, one of the first people to arrive after the event, noted that the smell was offensive to the extreme, like that of a dead body. Rebecca Crouch stood in the middle of her farm and looked at what had happened and believed, in the immediate moment of it, that something terrible had befallen her husband and her son, that these were pieces of them somehow finding a way to come home. She had lived through the Civil War. She had seen what violence did to bodies. Her farm had been a battlefield only 12 years earlier. The specific imagery of scattered flesh was not abstract to her. Her husband was fine, her son was fine. The meat remained unexplained. The Kentucky meat shower of 1876 is one of those events that seems at first glance too absurd to be real, and then turns out, upon examination, to be thoroughly and undeniably documented. The New York Times covered it on March 9th, 1876, 6 days after the event, in an article that treated it with the deadpan seriousness that the Times brings to genuinely inexplicable phenomena. Scientific American covered it. The Louisville Medical News covered it. Local Kentucky papers covered it. The event was reported across the country within weeks of its occurrence, and the coverage was not credulous or sensational in the modern tabloid sense. It was puzzled. Reporters and editors who were used to applying rational frameworks to events found themselves writing about something that did not fit any rational framework they had available. Let me give you the physical facts as they were documented at the time, because the details matter. The New York Times article from March 9th is worth sitting with for a moment. The Times was not a sensationalist publication in 1876. It was the paper of record for the most important city in the country. When the Times ran a story about meat falling from a Kentucky sky and ran it straight as a factual account of an observed event, it was making an editorial judgment that this was a genuine event worthy of public record. The paper described the meat as looking like beef, falling all around the witness while the sky was perfectly clear, falling like large snowflakes. No hedging, no winking, no suggestion that the witness was unreliable or the event implausible. Someone at the Times of New York had decided that meat falling from a clear Kentucky sky was simply a thing that had happened and reported it accordingly. The shower occurred between 11 in the morning and noon on March 3rd. The sky was unambiguously clear. Multiple witnesses confirmed this, and it is noted in every contemporary account. There was no storm, no unusual wind, no precipitation of any other kind. The meat fell over a strip of land, approximately 100 yards in length and 50 yards in width, following a rough northeast to southwest path across the Crouch farm. The pieces were predominantly small, mostly 2 to 3 inches square, but at least one piece was measured at approximately 4 inches across. The material was fresh when it fell. Witnesses noted that it appeared to be recently butchered flesh, not decomposed or dried. The day after the shower, a man named Harrison Gill, arrived at the farm and made careful observations. He noted the meat sticking out of fence rails and lying across the grass. He collected samples. He confirmed that the material was genuine flesh. He noted that the pieces were distributed in a pattern consistent with something being dropped or thrown from a significant height, not blown laterally by wind. The neighbors who came to the Crouch farm in the days following the shower described a scene that had a specific quality of wrongness that went beyond the merely strange. The fence rails had pieces of flesh caught in them. The grass was stained. The outbuildings had been hit. The distribution was not random. The material had clearly fallen along a path, concentrated in one direction, tapering off at the edges, the pattern of something dropped from above and moving, rather than something exploded outward from a central point. The Crouches and their neighbors walked the field and tried to make sense of what they were seeing. They could not. There was no framework available to them that made raw flesh falling from a clear sky into a sensible event. They collected pieces, they preserved them, they wrote to newspapers, they sent samples to scientists. They did exactly what rational people do when confronted with something that makes no sense. They gathered evidence and looked for explanations. Two unnamed gentlemen, their names are not recorded, which is either an act of historical mercy or a journalistic oversight, also arrived that day and did what curious men in 1876 apparently did when confronted with mystery meat from the sky. They tasted it. Their verdict, delivered with apparent confidence, was that it tasted like either mutton or venison. This is not a methodology that would receive ethical approval from a modern institutional review board, but it is a data point. The material was collected, preserved in glycerine, and sent to chemists, microscopists, and physicians across Kentucky, Ohio, and New York. The scientific community, to its credit, took the event seriously and subjected the samples to genuine analysis. The results were interesting, if not entirely conclusive. The first analysis came from Leopold Brandeis, a water analyst who examined the preserved samples and announced with some confidence that the material was not meat at all. It was, he said, nostoc, a type of cyanobacterium that forms colonies surrounded by a protective, gelatinous envelope. Nostoc was already known as a somewhat mysterious substance. It had been given colorful folk names: star jelly, witch's butter, star slubber. It was known to swell dramatically when it absorbed water, which had led to the belief that it fell from the sky during rainstorms. Brandeis identified the samples as nostoc cranium, described as flesh-colored in appearance, and announced that Scientific American had solved the mystery. There was one problem with the nostoc hypothesis. There had been no rain. The sky was clear. Nostoc swells when wet, but there was nothing to make it wet. Brandeis had failed to account for the central fact of the event he was explaining. His theory was subsequently dismissed. The more careful analysis came later, from a team of histologists, scientists, who examined tissue at the cellular level under microscope. Alan McLean Hamilton, J.W.S. Arnold, and Arthur Mead Edwards examined multiple samples from the shower independently and published their findings in the Medical Record, the American Journal of Microscopy, and Scientific American. Their conclusions were considerably more specific and considerably harder to dismiss than Brandeis's nostoc proposal. Of the samples they examined, 7, in Edwards's analysis alone, 2 were identified as lung tissue, 2 as cartilage, and 3 as striated muscle. The tissue structures were consistent with mammalian material. The cell organization was consistent with genuine flesh. Hamilton and Arnold described their findings in detail, including the specific microscopic characteristics of the muscle fibers and the cartilage cells. Edwards went further, creating a careful chain of custody record for each sample, tracking which specimen came from which collector and who had handled it. His work was published in Scientific American Supplement. The histological analysis left little scientific doubt that what fell on the Crouch farm was genuine animal tissue: lung, cartilage, muscle, connective tissue, the component parts of something that had been, until recently, alive. What kind of animal? Identifications varied across the different samples. Horse was suggested, deer, lamb, bear. Some accounts mention human tissue, though this identification is not supported by the more careful analyses. The material was from multiple animals, or multiple tissues from the same animal, or a combination. The variety of tissue types, lung, cartilage, muscle, was itself a significant data point because it suggested that whatever had produced the shower had contributed multiple different tissues from the same animal or animals, not just one type of flesh. The sky was clear. The meat was real. The tissue was from more than one part of an animal, possibly more than one animal. It fell over a specific path, in a distribution consistent with material dropped from height. One sample survived. In 2004, Kurt Godey, a professor at Transylvania University in Lexington, who has spent more than 2 decades studying the meat shower and has, with some amusement, described the way to become an expert on something as simply being the one person who cares about it, found a glass vial of the original 1876 material floating in a storage closet at the university. The vial contained preserved flesh, submerged in liquid, apparently undisturbed for decades. It is now kept at the Monroe Musnick Medical and Science Museum at Transylvania University, where it draws longer lines than most of the museum's other exhibits. Godey has had it analyzed. The preservation chemicals the material has been in formaldehyde, alcohol, and various other fluids over its century and a half have contaminated it beyond the point where reliable DNA sequencing is possible. Various identifications have been proposed over the years: horse, deer, lamb, bear, and in some accounts, human tissue. None of these identifications are definitive. The meat remains unidentified. The jar sits in Lexington. What had dropped it? The best explanation anyone has produced for the Kentucky meat shower appeared in the Louisville Medical News in 1876. In an article by physician L.D. Castenbein, Castenbein had obtained a sample of the material for himself. He set fire to it and observed that it smelled distinctly of rancid mutton. He examined it carefully, and then he proposed an explanation that was, by the standards of the available evidence, the most coherent anyone had offered. Vultures. Specifically, a flock of turkey vultures, or black vultures, both species are common in Kentucky, that had been flying over the Crouch farm at altitude and had, for reasons Castenbein described with a certain forensic delicacy, disgorged themselves. The vulture hypothesis requires a brief understanding of vulture biology, which is both fascinating and deeply unpleasant. Turkey vultures and black vultures are carrion eaters. They feed on carcasses. Their digestive systems are adapted to handle decomposing flesh that would be lethal to most other animals. Their stomach acid is extraordinarily strong, capable of killing anthrax, cholera, and most other pathogens present in rotting meat. They are, in a real sense, one of nature's most effective sanitation systems. They are also projectile vomiters. Vultures vomit as a defense mechanism and as a means of rapid weight reduction. When threatened or startled, they eject the contents of their crop, which can weigh up to 2 pounds, to lighten themselves for faster flight. The ejected material often lands in the face of whatever threatened them, and their stomach acid is corrosive enough to cause genuine injury. This is a highly effective deterrent. It is also, when practiced at altitude over a residential farm, somewhat problematic for the people below. To appreciate the specific mechanism, it helps to understand what a turkey vulture in flight looks like and how it feeds. Turkey vultures are large birds, a wingspan of roughly 6 feet, a body weight of around 4 to 5 pounds. They soar on thermal currents, often at significant altitude, covering enormous distances with minimal active effort. They locate carrion primarily by smell, an unusual capacity among birds. When a flock finds a large carcass, they feed together, consuming as much as possible before other scavengers arrive. A single turkey vulture can eat up to a pound of meat in one sitting. Their crops, the pouch-like organ at the base of the throat where food is temporarily stored before digestion, can hold a significant quantity of material. When startled or threatened, the response is immediate and specific. The bird vomits to lighten itself for faster takeoff, and the vomit, which smells extraordinarily terrible, a combination of partially digested carrion and the strongest stomach acid in the bird world, functions as a deterrent. The acid can cause genuine burns. Few predators are willing to pursue something that is actively attacking them with digestive fluid. In a flock of 20 or 30 birds, all startled simultaneously, all going through this response at roughly the same moment, the volume of material ejected would be considerable, and from altitude hundreds of feet, potentially much more, given vultures' soaring behavior. That material, scattered by the wind over the course of its fall, would cover a significant area of ground below. The key behavioral detail is the one that Kastenbein and the locals who first proposed the vulture theory both identified. Vultures are social vomiters. When one bird in a flock disgorges, others tend to follow. This is the mechanism described by contemporaneous observers with the phrase, "as is their custom," seeing one of their companions disgorge himself, immediately followed suit. If a flock of vultures was startled or disturbed while flying at altitude over the crouch farm, perhaps by a predator, perhaps by a sudden noise, perhaps simply by the proximity of the other birds, and if the lead bird vomited, the resulting chain reaction among the rest of the flock could produce exactly the pattern of evidence that was documented. Multiple tissue types from multiple animals, distributed over a specific path, in a distribution consistent with material drop from height. The variety of tissue types is, in fact, what makes the vulture theory work better than any alternative. Vultures feed on carcasses. A vulture that has been eating a deer would have deer tissue in its crop. A vulture that has been eating a horse would have horse tissue. If the flock had been feeding on multiple carcasses, which is common, as large flocks often find and consume multiple animals in close proximity, then the collective disgorging of that flock would produce a variety of tissue from a variety of sources, scattered across a path consistent with the flight direction of the flock. Lung, cartilage, muscle, connective tissue, all of it consistent with partially digested carrion, all of it consistent with what a group of vultures would have had in their crops after feeding. The specific identification of lung tissue is worth noting. Lung tissue is not something that appears in butchered meat as it is normally sold or consumed. Butchers remove lungs from carcasses. If you found a piece of lung tissue in a randomly selected chunk of market beef in 1876, it would be unusual. But if you are a vulture that has been eating a carcass, feeding directly on the body as carrion eaters do, without the selective processing of a butcher, you would consume lung tissue. You would consume cartilage. You would consume connective tissue. You would consume exactly the variety of tissues that the Kentucky samples showed. The presence of lung tissue in the shower samples is not damaging to the vulture theory. It is consistent with it, because it is the kind of tissue that appears in vulture vomit rather than in butchered meat. The vulture theory is not perfect. There are no eyewitness accounts of vultures in the area at the time. No one looked up and saw a flock of large birds before or during the shower. But this is not necessarily fatal to the theory. A flock of vultures flying at significant altitude, hundreds of feet, potentially more, might not be immediately visible from the ground, particularly if no one was looking up for them. The shower itself lasted only 2 minutes. By the time anyone thought to scan the sky for an explanation, the birds would have been well gone. There is also the question of the distribution pattern. The meat fell over a northeast to southwest path, roughly 100 yards long and 50 yards wide. This is consistent with material falling from a moving source, a flock of birds in flight, dropping material as they traveled. If the birds had been stationary, the distribution would have been more circular. The elongated path suggests motion, which is exactly what a flying flock would produce. The smell, which the local grocer described as offensive in the extreme, and like that of a dead body, is also consistent with vulture vomit. The partially digested carrion in a vulture's crop does not smell like fresh, butchered meat. It smells like something that has been pre-digested by some of the strongest stomach acid in the animal kingdom, sitting in a warm bird body for some hours. The description like a dead body is fairly specific and consistent with what you would expect from partially digested carrion rather than freshly slaughtered livestock. Kastenbein concluded his article with a statement that remains the most reasonable summary of the event. The only plausible theory explanatory of this anomalous shower appears to me to be that suggested by the old Ohio farmer, the disgorgement of some vultures that were sailing over the spot. From their immense height, the particles were scattered by the prevailing wind over the ground. The variety of tissue discovered, muscular, connective, fatty, structureless, can be explained only by this theory. Can it only be explained by this theory? Probably. But probably is doing some work there. The event was documented. The analysis was genuine. The vulture hypothesis is coherent and consistent with the evidence, but there are no vultures in the historical record of this event, no witnesses who saw anything in the sky, and the sample that survives a glass jar of preserved meat kept at the Monroe Musnick Medical and Science Museum at Transylvania University in Lexington, discovered in a storage closet in 2004, has been so heavily contaminated by successive preservation chemicals over a century and a half that DNA sequencing cannot produce reliable results. We have the meat, we cannot fully identify what it was, we cannot confirm where it came from. The vulture theory is the best answer we have. It is not a proven answer. The Kentucky meat shower remains, technically, unexplained. The Kentucky meat shower was not the only time something unusual has fallen from the sky. Animal rain events in which small animals fall to earth, usually associated with storms or waterspouts that lift them into the atmosphere and transport them miles before dropping them, has been documented in various forms across recorded history. Fish have fallen in Honduras. Frogs have fallen in England. In 1857, small beetles reportedly fell on a Slovenian village. In 1974, a rain of sprats was documented in Worcestershire. The Fortean tradition, named for Charles Fort, the early 20th century writer who collected reports of anomalous phenomena, has cataloged dozens of these events over the years. Charles Fort himself wrote about the Kentucky meat shower in his 1919 book, The Book of the Damned, a catalog of phenomena that, in his view, mainstream science had refused to adequately account for. Fort noted that there had been no rain to explain the event, and proposed, with characteristic deadpan, that the meat might have come from a higher level of existence. He did not seriously mean this. His point, in the context of his broader project, was that the scientific establishment of his day had a tendency to explain away anomalous phenomena rather than genuinely investigating them. He was not wrong about the tendency, even if his alternative explanations were deliberately unserious. Fort's role in the history of the Kentucky meat shower is an interesting one. He was not a scientist, and he did not pretend to be. He was a cataloger of anomalies, a collector of reports from newspapers and scientific journals of events that did not fit the accepted categories. He called the phenomena he collected damned data, information that mainstream science had excommunicated, in his word, from respectable inquiry, because it did not fit the prevailing framework. His writing has a quality of deliberate provocation about it. He is not always earnest about the cosmic explanations he proposes, and part of his project is to demonstrate that the boundary between what science accepts and what it rejects is more arbitrary than scientists like to admit. On the Kentucky meat shower specifically, Fort was essentially right to be skeptical of the easy dismissals. The Nostoc hypothesis was dismissed not because it was tested and found wanting. It was found wanting simply because there had been no rain, which was always obvious from the original accounts, and Brandeis should have known better. The scientific community's acceptance of the Nostoc explanation without apparent attention to the weather conditions on the day is exactly the kind of premature closure that Fort spent his career mocking. The histological analysis that eventually settled the question of what the material was did not reach its conclusions until months after Brandeis had already announced a solution. Science, in this case, did eventually get it right, but not before getting it embarrassingly wrong first. The Kentucky meat shower stands out from other animal rain events for several specific reasons. The sky was clear. There was no storm, no waterspout, no atmospheric mechanism that is typically invoked to explain how animals end up in the sky. The material was not small, light animals that might plausibly be lifted by a strong updraft. Chunks of flesh several inches across, some weighing what would have been significant fractions of a pound, would require considerable force to lift to any useful altitude. And the variety of tissue type suggests multiple sources or multiple animals rather than a single event that caught a single creature. The event also occurred at a moment in American history that gives it a specific texture worth noting. 1876 was the centennial year of the United States. The country was celebrating 100 years of independence with a great centennial exhibition in Philadelphia. It was also a country still processing the aftermath of the Civil War, which had ended only 11 years earlier. Bath County, Kentucky had been the site of the Battle of Mud Lick only 12 years before the meat shower, when cavalry forces had fought across the same farmland where Rebecca Crouch would later find flesh on her fence rails. The landscape of the Crouch farm was not an abstract setting for a strange event. It was a place with its own recent history of violence and loss. Rebecca Crouch's initial response, her fear that the scattered flesh was somehow connected to her husband and son, that it was pieces of people she loved coming home in the most terrible way she could imagine, is not irrational when you understand what she had lived through. A woman who had watched a Civil War cavalry battle on her land, who had lived through the specific violence of that era, who had understood from direct experience what happened to human bodies in war. Such a woman, confronted with raw flesh falling from a clear sky, would naturally reach for the explanation that her experience had prepared her for. She had seen what violence looked like. This looked like violence. She was wrong, almost certainly, but the reach was not irrational. It was the instinct of someone who had learned from experience what the world could do. There is something worth sitting with in the specific texture of the event's aftermath. The meat shower happened on a Friday. By the following Monday, people had traveled to the farm to see it. By the following week, the New York Times had run it. Within months, samples were being analyzed in multiple laboratories. The speed of this response, the immediate curiosity, the collection of evidence, the referral to scientific authority reflects something real about the culture of the period. The 1870s were a decade of great scientific confidence in America. Darwin had published On the Origin of Species less than 20 years earlier. The country was in the midst of an industrial revolution driven by scientific and engineering knowledge. There was a widespread belief that science could, eventually, explain everything if you gathered enough evidence and asked the right questions. The response to the meat shower was entirely in keeping with this spirit. A strange thing happened. Let us examine it carefully and find out why. The scientific response to the Kentucky meat shower is itself worth dwelling on, because it is a fairly good example of how science is supposed to work and occasionally does. The event was not dismissed. It was not explained away. Samples were collected and preserved. They were sent to recognized experts with no particular stake in any explanation. multiple independent analyses were conducted. The results were published in peer-reviewed scientific publications. The Nostoc hypothesis was proposed, examined, found wanting on the evidence, and discarded. The histological analysis was rigorous for its time, with careful attention to sample provenance and microscopic methodology. The best available explanation, the vulture theory, was proposed on the basis of the evidence and has never been seriously challenged on its merits. What the scientific community of 1876 did not have was the ability to definitively prove the vulture theory. They could show that the material was animal tissue. They could show that it included multiple tissue types from what appeared to be multiple animals. They could show that the distribution pattern was consistent with material dropped from a moving, elevated source, but they could not show a vulture. They could not trace the specific carcasses that had been consumed. They could not reconstruct the flock's flight path. And the sample that survives the jar of preserved meat at Transylvania University has been too contaminated by successive preservation methods over the past century and a half to yield the DNA evidence that would settle the matter definitively. The sample is still there, sitting in that museum in Lexington. It has been analyzed, reanalyzed, and found ultimately unresolvable. The jar of mystery meat from 1876 is the last physical remnant of an event that has never been fully explained. You can go see it. The museum is open to the public. Bath County, Kentucky, has done something interesting with its meat shower history. Rather than treating it as an embarrassment or a curiosity to be downplayed, the county has embraced it with a specific kind of Appalachian self-awareness that understands the difference between being laughed at and being in on the joke. The annual Meat Shower Festival features a mystery meat chili cook-off, exhibits about the event's history, and, on the 150th anniversary in 2026, a recreation of the shower using beef jerky dropped from an airplane. Nearly 500 people attended the 149th anniversary festival in 2025. The descendants of the Crouch family still live in the area. Sasha Reinhardt, who identifies as a descendant of the family, has described the meat shower as part of oral tradition in her community, a story that was always told, always a favorite, always treated as something that really happened, even when it sounded impossible. The gap between the strange event of 1876 and its current status as a community celebration is a gap that has been crossed over 150 years by the specific human capacity to find meaning, even pride, in the most bewildering things that happen to you. It rained meat on a farm in Kentucky. The sky was clear. The meat was real. The best explanation involves vultures, which is not a reassuring explanation, but is the best one available. And somewhere in Lexington, in a museum that also houses a 19th century device for blowing smoke into the bowels of drowning victims, there is a jar of preserved flesh that fell from a clear sky 150 years ago and has never been fully accounted for. That's what Strange Epochs is. Stories that have no clean endings. Moments that history recorded but never quite explained. Events that happened, undeniably happened, and yet still somehow feel impossible. There is one more thing about the Kentucky meat shower that I want to name before we close. The vulture hypothesis is almost certainly correct. Vultures were there. They vomited. The meat fell, but almost certainly is not the same as confirmed. And the specific chain of evidence that would confirm it, a description of a flock in the area, a DNA match between the preserved sample and a specific animal species, a flight path that could be reconstructed from contemporary accounts, does not exist in the historical record. The vultures, if they were there, left no trace except the meat itself. And so the Kentucky meat shower sits in a specific category of events, the ones where we have a very good explanation that is almost certainly right and no way to confirm it beyond reasonable doubt. It is the category where science and mystery overlap. The explanation is plausible and coherent and consistent with everything we know. It is not proven. The gap between almost certainly and definitely is, in this case, the gap that makes it a strange epoch rather than a solved problem. Everything you heard in this episode is real. Every name, every date, every detail drawn from documented historical sources. All of the sources for this episode are listed in the episode description below. I encourage you to look them up. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Strange Epochs wherever you listen. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And if you want to help the show grow, leaving a review goes a long way. It really does. I'll see you next week. I'm Sean Spainhour. This is Strange Epochs.